Okay, great. So we are so excited to have Stephanie Meredith, who is an author, an educator, and a parent of a child with special needs, give us this great presentation today, Bright Futures. Um, I will let Stephanie introduce herself in more detail, but we are just so grateful to have you, and I will turn it over to you now, Stephanie.
All right, thanks so much for having me, Sylvia. And, you know, for part of my time, I work on this employment project. It's a Kentucky Works grant that we received to improve employment outcomes for youth with disabilities in Kentucky. And what was really neat about it is that I ended up being put on this grant when my son was 16. So I was living it in real time because it was a 5-year grant starting when he was 16 and now he's 20, and we're in kind of the final year of this grant, and have created this family engagement curriculum to talk about improving employment outcomes for youth and how to prepare throughout the school years for a life of employment and our kids fulfilling their potential and their expectations for their futures. And the other projects that I work on, I also create resources for new and expectant parents learning about Down syndrome and other genetic conditions prenatally and postnatally. So those are kind of the two roles I have on both ends of the spectrum at our University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at the University of Kentucky. So that is what I do. And I'm also Andy's mom, who I just said is 20 years old. So this is not actually a picture of Andy, although you will see one. This is a picture of a young man with Down syndrome who works with Dr. Scott Coe at Mass General Hospital in Boston. So we're going to go through and talk about kind of setting some expectations about what employment means and what outcomes we can expect, and then some different strategies to get to where we ultimately want to be with employment. So, we're really looking at a bright future for people with disabilities right now where, more than ever, they're working in their communities. There are college programs that are available. And I just heard your happy news that Utah Valley just got a TIPSID grant and you are going to be having a post-secondary program there. I actually live in Georgia and we have I think 6 or 7 in our state now. And it is such a great time to be able to access those resources. People with disabilities are starting families, owning their own homes, speaking up for themselves and learning to be advocates. And self-advocacy is such a positive movement right now. And then also developing meaningful, inclusive friendships and relationships and living their independent lives based on their own dreams and goals. So that's really what we're focusing on, is how to get to access all of those really great opportunities that are available now. And, sometimes when we give these presentations, people say, oh, but that's only for those who are achieving a certain level and have certain talents and skills. And that's where I really like to share the story of Joe Steffi, because he is a 30-year-old man with Down syndrome who also has a dual diagnosis of autism and some limited verbal skills, but he also has some incredible strengths that he has used to his advantage to start this kettle corn business with his family. And I've been fortunate enough to actually be in Kansas City with Amy Allison and taste some of this kettle corn. It is delicious. And, he and his family were able to utilize the resources available to them as well as his skills in order to set up this business. They found that he was really able to work for 6 hours at a time and sustain that. He liked watching people and following their directions. And he also liked the repetitiveness of popping and bagging the popcorn. And so they found that he had these skills. And then they also were able to access some resources from the Kansas Council on Developmental Disabilities, Voc Rehab, and Social Security in order to get some startup funding for this business. And this is a man who, when he went to his transition meeting in high school, they said he's never going to be able to have a job. He's going to end up, you need to just prepare to put him in a group home. He's not going to be able to have a job and to live on his own. Well, now Joe does live on his own, and he runs this kettle corn business with his family, and they post annual sales of about $75,000 a year. So even though someone has what some people consider to be some pretty significant disabilities, they still also have talents and skills that they can contribute and resources available to them to run successful businesses and to find meaningful employment. So I guess I want to kind of take some time right now. And if we were all together, we would be having those handouts in front of us that Sylvia sent to you. But to just think about, what are some of your hopes and dreams for your son or daughter's future?
And folks, we invite you to either use the chat feature right now to contribute, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand or just unmute your microphone and contribute.
Okay, so I'll talk. Really, for me, my hopes and dreams for my girls is no different than for my other children. I want them to find valuable ways that they can contribute their own gifts and talents to the community. I want them to have independent social relationships. I want them to have independence. I want them to continue to grow and learn. I want them to be healthy. Same as all my other children.
Absolutely. And I think really when we set those expectations, right from the outset, it helps us to be preparing and working toward those goals throughout the school years. And that's really what we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about what it means when people talk about meaningful competitive employment, because for a long time that's meant different things. For employment has meant different things for people with disabilities in a way that was not the same as it is for everybody else, and we're trying to change that. So we're going to talk about what that means too. Did anybody else want to share anything before we move on?
I will. I've actually been looking into starting a self-sustaining nonprofit program where we can help kids and adults, well, teens and adults with special needs, train them for jobs and have people in the community come in and mentor them for positions in customer service and other things, and then train them for 6 to 12 months or however long they need, and then place them hopefully into some of these businesses that come in and help mentor them.
Yeah, and I think there's really great models out there to look at. And if you ever want to follow up with me, I can definitely share that information if you don't already have it. But mentorships are incredibly powerful in building those relationships, and also giving students those work experiences that they can transition into employment, but also giving employers that vision of what our youth with disabilities can do.
I would love to.
Yeah.
More information from you. So.
Whitney, definitely send me an email at the end, and I will have that available for you guys to do, because I would love to follow up with you on that.
Thank you.
All right, and then Taylor, you were first court in college. You went to Utah State. Yes, the Aggies Elevated program. That's very cool, and there are such great college opportunities now, and it improves the employment outcomes for youth with special needs as well. So, there are really so many resources available, and it's important that when our kids are growing up, that people are asking them, what do you want to be when you grow up? For a lot of our older people with Down syndrome and other disabilities, they weren't asked that when they were little. It was just kind of assumed you're going to go into certain career paths. But it's important to ask them, what do they want to be? Because every child deserves that opportunity to follow their talents and dreams. And it's important for us to make employment a goal at an early age. And so when we talk about working in the community for a competitive wage, we mean that people are working part-time or self-employed or with supports, but they're in the competitive labor force, which means they are working on the payroll of a competitive industry, not a provider. So they're working for they're working for a company in the community or an organization, just like anybody else, and they're being paid by that organization. And it's not done through a group home. It's not being done in a sheltered workshop, but they're working among everyone else for at least minimum wage and benefits where applicable. Now, sometimes people, and the great thing about that is that we are increasingly having more legislation that supports employment as a priority for all people. You know, a lot of states have employment first initiatives where they say, you know, the first thing to do is look for jobs for people and try to identify employment opportunities before we start looking at any kind of group placement or something like that. With the IDEA, we now have, you know, the transition provisions where people are supposed to be having those conversations, starting really at 14 and then really solidly looking at employment options at 16. We also have WIOA Section 511 restricting the use of sub-minimum wage, and we have other legislation right now looking at making sure all people get paid at least minimum wage. And we also have pre-employment training services through WIOA, and every state administers that in different ways. Sometimes it's through your school district, sometimes it's through a nonprofit. There are different ways that that can be done. But the point being that we have a lot of federal legislation that is backing up employment being the first priority for people with disabilities and having that be competitive integrated employment. So, you know, you want to make sure that the school transition conversation starts early. And it should be starting at 14, and by age 16, making sure that there's an employment goal in the IEP. Now, this can be a really powerful leverage as your kids are getting older, and I'll give it an example here. So we had at our school some different career tracks that people were looking at for people with disabilities. Sometimes it was, they had a coffee shop, which that was something that my son was interested in, but they also had some tracks where they were having kids do janitorial work. Now, I didn't find out about this until about halfway through Andy's first semester in high school. And he was like, Mom, I don't, you know, I clean at home. I don't want to clean at school. And so this was an opportunity to go back in and talk about his IEP transition goals, because what we had identified at that time was that Andy was interested in photography. And so we were able to say, look, this, you know, these janitorial work opportunities you're talking about aren't something that he's actually indicated he's interested in. He's interested in photography. So wouldn't it be more appropriate, instead of having him do that, to have him take yearbook, because that's where he can actually take pictures. And so if you have some really clearly articulated employment IEP goals, then you can also structure their school experiences to follow those IEP goals, so that you don't end up kind of stuck on a track that you didn't intend to be on. So, so that's something to kind of be mindful of, and to make sure that your annual goals related to your son or daughter's post-employment or post-school employment goal follows what they really want to do. And when we talk about flexible and customized employment, I'm also not saying that that has to be, you know, a full-time job with benefits. That can be really different for each person. And so this actually is a picture here from my employee. I have a shipping clerk who has autism, and he's really great at that. And he works about, you know, 10 hours a week for me at $12 an hour. Well, $12.50 now, we just got a raise. And that's a competitive wage. And then he also works for the local grocery store, probably another 15 to 20 hours a week. And then he's starting an Etsy store for his art. And so he's doing some self-employment as well. So it's not a situation where he necessarily has a full-time with benefits job, but he's put together a patchwork of different employment that is working really well for him based on his interests and his needs. So it can be really different for each person. So I want you to take some time now and kind of think about, what is the role of employment that you hope, the role of employment in your son or daughter's life, and what role you hope it plays. And you can write it in the chat. Let's see if you can come up with all the different ideas that we've thought of. So really thinking about what is employment going to provide? What kind of needs is that going to fulfill for your son or daughter? So Julie says to give them purpose, something to get excited about doing every day. Absolutely. That's what gets a lot of us up in the morning, just knowing what our job is for the day. Yeah, social needs, structure and routine, sense of accomplishment, greater independence. Those are all wonderful roles of employment. Great. And so these are some that we also thought of too. Those social connections, those friends you make at work are so meaningful. Schedule and routine, self-esteem and being fulfilled. Absolutely. That sense of worth to know that you're contributing to the world like everyone else. And also contributing specific talents. Money. It's nice to have money to spend on your own. I remember, so Andy has, and so I guess I get to kind of tell Andy's story now about how he got his job. So we were driving home from high school one day, and he said, "Mom, I want to go get a job at Publix, which is our local grocery store." I was like, okay. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, we got to check about a job coach. We've got to check about, what kind of supports we have in place. What do we need to negotiate with them? And in Andy's head, he was telling me what he was going to do that day. And so I said, okay, Andy, I'll look into it. And I get home and I start making dinner and I'm on the phone with my mom. And as soon as I finish up, I send my daughter to go get him. And she's like, "Mom, he's gone." And we went out to the garage and his bike was gone. So I start panicking because it's starting to get kind of dark. And then I realized I had 2 missed calls on my phone from when I was talking to my mom. And it was from Andy. And he said, "Mom, I go to Publix, I go get a job, you come get me." And I was like, oh my gosh, he took off on his bike on his own because there's a major intersection. I mean, we've done it like 40 times as a family, but he'd never done it on his own before. And so I'm driving over there, really panicked, calling the store saying, "Can you please just make sure he doesn't leave? I'm coming to pick him up and I don't want him to drive or to ride his bike home at night by himself." And as I'm driving and, kind of frantic, my husband calls and he says, "Stephanie, can you imagine? Would you have ever imagined when he was born that your fear at 16 years old was that he took off on his bike on his own to go get a job?" I was like, okay, good point. And I got there and sure enough, he'd ridden his bike over there. He'd gone to talk to some friends who were working, the cash register and asked him how you get a job. They took him to the customer service desk and he started to do the kiosk by himself, but he couldn't quite get it done. He needed help with entering in the information and typing and stuff. But they were so impressed with his initiative that they said, yeah, we'd love to hire him. And so we just need to have him go through the interview process and everything. And so we practiced and we did all that. And sure enough, he got hired. And so this is a picture of Andy with his first paycheck. And it was really cool when he started getting paid on his own because, we went to IKEA one day and I went to go buy ice cream for his sisters. And he said, "No, Mom, I got this." And so when I brought the girls their ice creams, they said, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Mom." And he said, "Thank you, me." And there was that sense of pride that was money he earned to buy his own ice cream. And to have, that independence, and also because they're just adults like everyone else and want to do what everyone else is doing at that age, right? And that was the value for him of inclusion and also being part of the community at his school, because he saw that that's what all the other boys his age were doing to earn money for dates and cars and all those things. They were working at the grocery store. So now I want you guys to just take some time, take a few minutes on your own to just think about, what does your son or daughter like to do? What's something you could envision them doing as a job in the future? And what are some of their talents or skills? And I'll tell you a little story about that too. So I had, probably about a couple years ago, I was giving this presentation in Kentucky, and there was a mom who was getting noticeably more agitated as we were talking. And ultimately she said, you're saying all these things, but I have a child with a significant intellectual disability, and I just can't imagine what he would do. And so we sat and we kind of talked through it. And I said, well, what's he interested in? And she said, well, he really likes horses and animals. And, I'm sitting there thinking, boy, you're really in the greatest position here in Lexington, Kentucky, because it is the horse, capital of the world. And so we talked about how, you have to look at what their talents and skills are. And because he's interested in horses, a good role for him could be to start volunteering at one of the stables in that area and to learn how to do some horse care, to learn how to do some mucking. And we talked about how my son, when he was 12, started volunteering at the local stables here. And I mean, we called it poop scooping camp, because he would go and he would have to learn, how to do some of that care. And it teaches them also the meaning of work and getting an assignment and getting it done. So maybe just take some time to think about what your own son or daughter likes to do. Because it's really important to have that in mind, even when they're little. Because Andy's, forming a career as a photographer now, but that started when he was 8. We saw him we gave him the camera, and we saw that some of the pictures turned out really cool. And so his uncle's a photographer, and we asked, what are some ways that you would recommend that he start developing that? And he said, well, print out the pictures that actually turn out the best and have the best eye, and print those out and put them around his room. And so we did. We had like this, wire kind of picture hanging gallery that we put around his room. And so we were reinforcing that he was good at that. And he started to develop pride in it. And then he also started to recognize when those pictures actually were really good, because he would take thousands of pictures and probably only 2% of them are really good. But now he's to the stage at 20 where, 7 out of 10 pictures are keepers. So it's, but it takes recognizing it early on and cultivating that talent throughout the years. And so this is where some of these vision statements can be really helpful to share that vision also with the professionals in their lives, because sometimes, the professionals in our lives might get stuck in certain tracks too, where they think, well, we've got these 3 employers that are willing to hire people with disabilities, so we're going to shuttle people towards Home Depot, we're going to shuttle them towards this grocery store, and we're going to shuttle them towards this particular florist, and so they just kind of get that in their head. But it's important to let them know the talents and skills that your youth has, so that they can, prepare and be more creative in helping you find opportunities for them. And I love this one. This was shared with me by Tiffany Stafford. It's a 1-page vision statement that she has on Canva that other people can access and modify and use themselves. But I love that it's starting at 4 years old with sharing with professionals. In her future, we envision her doing work that she enjoys and that makes her feel productive. So we're setting that expectation right from the get-go. And then we talk about what her strengths are early on and what doesn't work. That sometimes there's strategies you might use with a kid thinking they're going to be effective, and they just, it's not going to be the best course to take with that kid. And it doesn't mean that they can't do it or that they're uncooperative. It just means that's not a great strategy for them. So this is a really great way to share, even from an early age, what the vision is for the future. And so this is actually an example of one that we created for my son, Andy. As our kids age, it's important to make sure that they are part of that process and leading that process ideally. And so you can see that in the vision statement, it starts to be a lot more his own language. I get my own studio. My talent is taking pictures. I get a small house. I also work at Publix. I keep my money in the bank. I want to go to college and live in a new house by myself, which, by the way, was totally meant to be a dagger toward me, but that's okay because I'm proud of his desire to be independent. But at this age too, we should also be talking about their accomplishments. They should be having some opportunities to participate in extracurriculars, scouts, all of those things that you can share as accomplishments that they've had, what strategies work for them, and what their strengths are. So at that point, they're starting to also shape the vision statement. And I'm going to show you actually right here. We're going to hop out for just a second. If you come to our website, you can actually see where this is, and these links to this are all in your handout, so you should be able to access this. But we've got a Brighter Futures vision statement where you've got a PDF or a Word template. So if you want to use it, you can do that yourself. And we also have a video demonstration where we interviewed a young woman and helped her create her vision statement. So you can see what it looks like when they are an involved partner in that process. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and take some questions from you guys and turn on my light because it's getting really dark in here because I'm on the East Coast all of a sudden. There we go. So does anybody have any questions? All right, we're going to skip a few of these. We're going to talk about preparing for work, starting, and what the continuum of work looks like when you're starting from an early age to then prepare for work as an adult. And I'm using our friend Isaiah here as an example. Isaiah got himself this job at a restaurant when he was friendly and met with a guy that I think he met at the stadium where he was also working in Boston. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can prepare throughout the years and what that looks like. So, say you've got a young person who wants to get involved in, the restaurant industry. They're interested in cooking and also in hospitality. So what would that look like over the years? So when you start off, when they're little, it looks like giving them chores at home. When you finish eating your dinner, you take your plate to the sink. You teach them how to do some basic kinds of cooking. Oh, Julie asked a question, so I'm going to pause for just a minute. She said, is there anything you wouldn't put in a vision statement? How do you rein in lofty goals? Okay, so I think I will say that it seems like over time, those lofty goals, a lot of kids have lofty goals starting off when they're little, and that's really great that they are aiming high. I will tell you that when we had Andy's first IEP meeting where he actually contributed, his employment goal was to be a spy, and that was what he wanted to do. And so we kind of talked about it in terms of steps, like it's really hard for someone to go into being a spy all of a sudden. So we would talk about what is it that you're actually really good at in a job you want to start with, and then we can move up. And I mean, realizing that can be possible with certain things. So, because we have a friend who has Down syndrome who was aiming to be an assistant teacher, and she actually just finished her bachelor's, and she's worked that way. I don't know that Andy's going to be to that point, but I think what we ended up doing was breaking it down into steps. And we said, okay, so right now you're really good at photography. So maybe you could be a crime photographer at some point. But right now, let's talk about what you can do to develop your photography skills, because that's a job you can start off with right now. The other thing I've seen to help rein in some of those lofty goals is paid work and seeing what they can, when they actually earn money for something, that helps them to realize, oh, I can't get paid for being a vet right now, but I can get paid right now for, selling this piece of art. And that can also help to motivate them too, because they like that direct reward. So those are a few things. And as far as anything I wouldn't put in a vision statement, I would just make sure to avoid anything that where it's more directed, where parents are maybe taking too much initiative with older students, and not letting them guide the conversation. And yeah, you still have to rein in you have to rein in some realism, but I mean things as in, if they really hate doing laundry, then you want to make sure as a parent, you're not really pushing them towards something that is not something they really want to do. Like going into the hotel industry and working in that area if they really don't like doing laundry. The other things I would avoid are just making sure that you are modeling respectful language about your student for the educators in their lives, and maybe being sure not to disclose anything that wouldn't be relevant to the educators. I mean, they don't need to know if your child is struggling with the bathroom at night, for example, so something that wouldn't actually impact their education, I would be sure not to include that in there. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but those are kind of the first thoughts that come to my mind. But as far as the continuum of work, we'll kind of jump back into that. With that, so if you're preparing for a job in the restaurant industry, chores at home would be putting dishes in the sink, learning to cook simple things like how to, when they're little, maybe how to do toast, but then moving into how to make scrambled eggs. And making sure that you're giving them those chores along the way. And we've got in the handout a link to a website that tells you what age-appropriate chores are at different ages. And that can be really helpful to know, even if your child isn't doing age-appropriate chores for their age, it helps you to know what the next step would be from where they're at. So make sure that they're having those chores so that they're learning to do that. And then, if you're doing school and community activities to prepare for a restaurant job, well, then you could do the cooking Scout Merit Badge. You could be doing home ec as a class at school. So there are lots of different ways that you can move from when you can access those different kinds of activities in the school and community. You might be taking some cooking classes. Those are some ways you can do that. But then we look into leadership and volunteer work. So then maybe the next step would be you volunteer at a local food pantry and you get some experience there with volunteering and leadership. Maybe you're going and helping at a nursing home to help people there. Then the next would be community work experiences. So you find out, oh, I've got this neighbor who owns a catering business, and she needs some help with some people to serve food at a wedding. And maybe your student then does that a few times and actually gets paid, $20, and has a paid work community experience. And then you move into, at that point, they would have had all of those extracurriculars. They would have the paid work experiences, and then they could apply for a job at a restaurant and say, I've had all of these different ways in which I've prepared. And then, you're moving then from that small kernel of a desire to actually being prepared for a job. All right. And I'm gonna also refer back here to Taylor's answer to Julie. She says, to answer that question, she's a teacher and works with special needs children at Kids on the Move, because I love children, and that was my major from Utah State that I graduate from. And I love that work with all kinds of children. My background is special needs because I can relate to it, because I do have a disability. And that is so important. It's important for our kids with disabilities to be seeing models of people who look like them and who have the same kinds of conditions, who are out in the community doing work and seeing what the possibilities are. I mean, that I remember, so when Andy was born, we actually lived in Provo. We went to the Provo Early Education Program, and there was a woman with Down syndrome who worked there. And that was so powerful to me as a young mom, to see someone who had the same condition that my son had out in the world, earning a living on her own. She was married, and just to be setting that example for us. So that's very powerful, Taylor. And so what are some things you can do to start early to prepare for work? You can start, like we talked about before, complimenting and cultivating their skills and talents early on. If you see that they're a good artist, or that they're good with children, or that they're interested in medicine, talk to them about how proud you are of what they're doing and ask about their interests. You can also explore careers. If they're interested in animals, you can read a story about what it's like to become a vet. Read books to them about growing up and getting a job. There's the great Berenstain Bears book, When I Grow Up, but there's tons of books like that. And also making sure that your youth with disabilities has chores and responsibilities, just like all the other kids in the family. I have a friend who's got 2 siblings with Down syndrome, and a quote that she uses a lot is she says, your child with a disability should not be the hub of the wheel, they should be one of the spokes. And it's going to foster better relationships between kids too when everybody has household chores. Now, they might not be exactly the same, and they might have to be modified based on what your child can do at that point, but it's important to make sure that they are learning those lessons. Also giving them supports, motivation, and consequences. Sometimes it might mean breaking things down with social stories so that they learn those expectations of doing chores and making charts for them. And also demonstrating how to do chores and breaking them down into steps. When Andy was little, he couldn't take really complex steps. We had to really break it down into, okay, we can just say, go put away the ball. We'd have to say, okay, go get the ball from outside and then bring it inside and put it in the basket. So it might require some of that. It's also important in preparing for work to encourage inclusion as much as possible. The reason why that's so important is because the people that they go to school with are going to be the people that they eventually work with, and they need to be able to get along with all of those people in order to navigate different jobs that might be available. And some different ways that you can do that are making sure they're involved in local integrated school and community classes. There's so many different opportunities out there. Dance, sports, martial arts, unified sports now is available through Special Olympics, where they combine youth with disabilities with youth who do not have them. School teams and activities. Actually, my son is not here right now because he is off coaching lacrosse, because when he was in high school, he ended up being invited to be part of the lacrosse team, which kind of freaked me out at first because I thought, oh, this is kind of a dangerous sport, right? But the coach said that he had actually had a lab partner when he was in 7th grade who had Down syndrome, who meant a lot to him. And he wanted to make sure that his boys on the team had that same kind of experience, and also that Andy was included as a full member and not, a mascot for the team. He's like, I want him to actually be, working out with us, and we want him to actually get some game time. And it ended up being a situation where Andy ended up making himself the team captain by about halfway through the season. And by the end, he became one of the coaches and has continued on through the years. So our kids can be meaningfully included in those ways. And he's not fast. He wasn't because he's particularly adept at the sport, but because he's a good leader. And that comes from, giving our kids opportunities to be involved with everyone else. Sometimes you might have more structured clubs like Friends Club and Best Buddies, where they actually are training other peers how to offer peer mentorship. We've got faith-based groups and also Girls and Boy Scouts. Those are really great structured ways for our youth to learn how to be involved with everyone else, and then also to start taking leadership roles. So it's important that if our kids are involved in some of these different activities, that they're also getting opportunities to learn how to be leaders. And that can be, being a president of a Sunday school class and having to give the announcements. It can be organizing projects charitable projects that they're involved with. This is actually Andy digging the hole for the benches for his Eagle Scout project. And at that point, a lot of the other boys had kind of dropped off and they weren't getting the last bit of their stuff done, but Andy was still going. They were a little bit distracted by girls in cars. And when he started doing his, they all started working together. And so we had 3 scouts get ready or finish up at the same time. But that was because of some leadership there. So I think that it's important that our kids get that leadership opportunity, those leadership opportunities in volunteering. But it's also important to recognize that volunteering is a stepping stone toward employment, but we don't want them to plateau there, because we want them to get paid for their talents and the work that they do. So I want you all to think about right now, what are 2 steps you could take at home or in the community right now to start preparing for work? Because I gave you guys lots of ideas, and sometimes that can be overwhelming, but you don't have to do all of it. You know, you just pick the 2 things that you think are doable right now, and to kind of boil it down to that. And I want to talk a couple of minutes about concerns about employment, but we're not going to have time to delve into that too much, just because that's a whole other section of its own. But I do want to point you to some really great resources. Sometimes people are worried quite a bit about losing benefits as their child ages, but I wanted to show you a really cool resource that was developed at our institute to address some of those concerns. And there's a link to it in the handout, but it's this Kentucky Works SSI 101 video. And it talks about how you can work and still receive SSI, some Medicaid coverage as needed. And it goes through the different resources available for that. But it's basically a 15-minute video where these experts talk about how work and some of these benefits can fit together, and that really you have to start earning quite a bit of money before it even starts impacting the ability to access Medicaid and some of the health care benefits that people need. So I just think it's important to know that there are resources out there. And we also have a learning module that you can go through that explains the math. Because I know before Andy turned 18, I had no idea how that math worked. And this learning module, when I went through it, I was like, okay, so, you know, if he earns $500 a month and he's getting $700 for, he would get $700 for SSI. It just reduces it by a percentage, but he still ends up with more money overall because he has the money from work. So it's important to know that you can combine work and SSI, and it actually ends up being more than if someone just gets SSI alone. So that's just something to be mindful of, to know what the different resources are to help with that. All right. And so that's the link to some of those resources. And again, these are all in your handout, and you can explore those later if that's something that you want to learn about now. But for some of you, I know you've got younger students, so these are just kind of something maybe to put on the back burner, and to know that you absolutely can combine work and benefits, and that once you and that there are tools out there to help you understand the math. So I think, since we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I would really love for those of you who have questions to get to ask them, I would love to go ahead and take some of your questions. And if you want to do like the little, you can type them in the chat box, or you can do a little hand raise if that's more comfortable. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I will continue, but I did want to make sure. Okay, good. I'm going to talk a little bit about voc rehab. Yes, I think voc rehab can be very different depending on where you live. I know that in my work state of Kentucky, they have a very robust voc rehab where they provide, they're really good at helping people identify jobs and providing support. Where I live in Georgia, it's not as robust. We've actually had kind of a beleaguered voc rehab system, but we were able to get them to actually start providing some services. Now, granted, that required an email to the head of the state voc rehab, but we did make it happen because they can provide things like job training. They can provide job coach. So, for example, Andy got this job where he's working in the grocery store, and then he needed to brush up on some skills. He needed to know how to count the number of carts. He needed to know how to, do some appropriate bagging of certain materials. And so we brought in a job coach, and voc rehab covered the cost of that. They can also provide some supplemental equipment, like say you need a timer or other kinds of adaptive equipment to be successful at work. They can provide those things. They can also provide some job training offsite. So, and sometimes voc rehab can help actually identify the available job opportunities and help you to find them. So I feel bad because I can't give you specifics about Utah, but I do know that it really depends on where you live, how effective they are. But they do have a significant amount of funding, and they have they should be providing those opportunities to do job search, job support, and job support. So that's something to be aware of. And then from Danielle, what do you recommend for a 15-year-old? What's best way to get started on the employment track with school? So what I would recommend with a 14-year-old is to really, ask them what their interests are and to look at what you've seen they're good at. And I would try to craft IEP goals based on that, because otherwise, if we as parents and as individuals with disabilities don't do it, a lot of the professionals just think that they're just going to assume where they should go. And so I would say that it's important to go ahead and start drafting what you think would be effective IEP goals based on, or an effective IEP goal based on their interests and skills. And it could be, so like in our case, it could be, I want them to learn how to, or to participate in an extracurricular activity that cultivates their interest in technology, or I want them to take a class that focuses on developing, if they're interested in technology, the robotics class. Okay, so I'm seeing that Carter has her hand raised, and I hope that helped. Thanks, Danielle. Okay. Carter, did you want to ask that?
I think we have that question from Carter in the chat. Do you have any resources for starting a business to employ my young person and others?
Do you know, actually, I do know of some different online resources that you can look at as far as examples. But I think also it is really helpful to check with your local voc rehab, developmental disabilities council, and there are specific resources on the Social Security website about submitting proposals for work ideas to get funding. And so if you follow up with an email to me, I can get that to you, because there are a number of resources out there. I think for me too, the other really helpful resource is to find out what other families have done and to look at how those examples fit together. And I can also tell you in our case, what we've done, so my husband already owned a business, and so we've started Andy's photography business actually since COVID, because he couldn't really work at the grocery store anymore. And so we kind of we started his business as part of my husband's, so it can be really tailored to what your individual family situation is, because there are a lot more tax breaks if you already have your own business as opposed to starting a new one. And then there are different regulations involved if you're doing it through the Social Security Administration as opposed to just taking regular business benefits. But I would be happy to talk with you in more depth about that one-on-one, because there are a lot of different details that we can discuss with that. But needless to say, there are lots of resources out there available for that. Julie, about Voc Rehab. Okay, first or one-time job. I will say, so Voc Rehab, when you open a case, they have to close it, but you can open a case multiple times. And I know this because we've done that. So you might find that your son or daughter, needs help to start, they want to work at a grocery store, and that's just a starting high school job. You can get help in that job and getting job coaching and stuff, but then they're gonna have to close that out before you can start a new one. Say, oh, now I want to start a business doing, art on Etsy, and I want to know how, and I want to get some startup capital for setting up my website or something, right? Then you would have to open a new case, and then they would want you to resolve that case before you started something else. So an adult can access Voc Rehab multiple times, but they just have to open a case and close it out. So I hope that makes sense. Let's see. I think there was another one, Olgato. I'm not sure where to start. I feel like I'm a little behind where we should be. So I'm actually going to skip. I'm going to go to a slide about some parent action steps. And so it's really important just to kind of figure out what small step you can take right now, because you don't have to do everything all at once. And so this would be some examples. So if you wanted to take some action steps as a parent right now for a younger child, maybe it's teaching your child to put away their laundry and putting labels on the drawers so that you're practicing some independent skills. And then maybe make an IEP speech goal to learn proper greetings, because you're going to need to do that as an employed person. And then maybe sign them up for an extracurricular that you think they would enjoy and would develop a talent. But maybe if it's an older child, you would make an IEP transition goal about creating a personal website for showcasing her art. She's interested in art, and so we want to make sure that she's developing that skill to sell that talent. And maybe for her, it's applying for a post-secondary camp, so she's getting the experience of going to college and seeing what that's like. We have those here where it's like a week of post-secondary camp to see what it's like before you sign up. And then maybe teaching her to actually use a washing machine, okay? So she's developing those independent skills. So those are some different ways that you can take, steps right now that aren't too much to bite off, but still are making substantial progress toward where you need to be. All right, I am sorry. I'm going to try to scroll through some more of these questions. Most jobs I've seen in Utah are either janitorial and rec center or baggers at grocery stores, which may be fine for some, but I think something like the bagger one will soon be eliminated with online orders, delivery, etc. I think that is a very reasonable concern, and I think that in some ways, I hope COVID is forcing people to be a little more creative in how they approach it. And that's why it's really important to find out what the actual interests of youth are, and making sure that the professionals in your life know what their interests are. So if they want to be a teacher, then that's what we should be working toward. If they want to be, an artist, that's what we should be working toward. And so I think and sometimes that requires bucking the system a little bit. Like in a lot of high schools around here, it's coffee shops. Like everybody's headed toward a coffee shop. And again, that's one of those industries where, especially with COVID, there's a lot of limitations because people aren't going into those kinds of establishments right now. So if you if you don't diversify people in the different industries that they're going into, first of all, you're missing out on a lot of employers who would be willing to give people a chance on a job. But I think you're also missing out on the amazing talents they have to contribute to the world. And so I will just kind of take a couple of minutes. We're at the very end here. And actually, I've got another thing for Olgato. So another thing we recently created was these checklists for a bright future. And it's a one pager that tells you, the top things you can do at each age to prepare for to prepare for employment. We haven't gotten all of the ages done yet. We've got 3 to 5, 6 to 10, 16 to 18, one for students and one for parents. And it kind of tells you the top things you should be doing in order to prepare at those different ages. And I think that that's one thing that you can do to know how to get started at whatever age your youth is at. You can see when you click on it, for 3, and it's going to be very different depending on their ages, but it gives you some really concrete things you can do in the moment. But as far as having those specific jobs, I think the other things that are really helpful are to show educators and the professionals examples of other people who have been successful in different types of careers. There are wonderful examples of people who've gotten involved as teaching assistants, medical assistants, actors, artists, all kinds of different jobs. And it really, and I know NDSS spotlights some of them, and so do other advocacy organizations, but it's important to make sure sometimes that professionals can see that it's possible. And a lot of times they need examples in order to do that. But I'll show you. And so this is what we ended up doing. And again, a grocery bagging job can be great if that's what you want to do, or if you're at the age of life where that's what everybody else is doing anyways, right? But in our case, that kind of dried up as we were dealing with COVID and things, and so we worked on creating the website for Andy's art. And I think that we can spend some time, especially during this era where we're looking at what some of these other skills are and how we can build careers out of them. I mean, again, if you're interested in animals, then it's important to be, apprenticing with a vet or something, where you can actually cultivate that particular skill. And will there be a list created for what to do with 11? Yes, we're working on that this year. We're going to split that up between 11 and 13 and 14 and 15, just because the transition conversation starts at 14. So we want to make sure to give people specific instructions for that. But then also those middle school years are kind of tricky navigating socially. And so we have some specific recommendations for how to overcome some of that, some of the challenges that people encounter there. And yes, we've got a 21 plus or an 18 plus that we're going to be developing too, Taylor. So those are our 3 age groups that we're working on in 2021 and the end of 2020. So other questions? I'm sorry I'm going over time, but I do love to talk about this and to share ideas. And these are all great questions, and I'm really glad you asked them. Did I miss anybody?
I'm just going to unmute myself for a minute because it's easier. I'm Trisha Holgado. Are you how do we access all these handouts? It's going to be in the email, or how do we get them?
So if you go to the top of the chat with Sylvia, she
Okay.
has the Brighter Futures worksheet, and I think she sent it as an email too. And
oh, okay.
If you go there, the links should be active in that handout, so you can access all the resources. That's a great question there. And actually, I'll go ahead and share my email with all of you. If anyone has follow-up questions that they would like to ask, you're welcome to email me. All right, but I think these are all really great questions because, and I do have a blog post. We've got a blog through Kentucky Works where I talk about kind of the idea that people with disabilities get sent down certain paths, and that it's important to make sure that we don't allow kind of that stagnation in thinking, that there are lots of different opportunities out there, and we need to be creative in the way that we approach it. So here's the blog, and other parents share some of their ideas too. but I think that there is a post where we specifically talk about that. See if I can find it. So it's from a little pad. There you go. Avoiding assumptions. So I'm going to put this in the chat window so you can follow up and read some of the recommendations in there. All right. Any other questions? And so I go through, I actually give 6 different points in that article to avoid the pitfalls of getting stuck into certain career tracks that sometimes happen to our population of people. Anybody else? Well, thank you guys so much for giving me your time. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish I had even more time because it's about 2 hours of content. I try to fit into 1 hour, and that usually ends up being how it is. But I would love to follow up another time if you guys would ever like me to. So thank you for having me, and have a great night.
Can I ask one question? Sorry, I just had a hard time getting to this. A lot of things I have seen in some people is that they will start a business, or the parent will start a business, and some will become even fashion designers. And this is in other countries that provide some opportunities like that, or the hotels in Italy that are entirely worked by people with Down syndrome, or restaurants where all the waiters have Down syndrome. And those opportunities are just not available in this country. And so I feel almost like I have to create because it's not available, especially in Utah. We're so behind. And it is frustrating, but I'm wondering if you are aware of corporate America needs to be brought into the loop. And I think they are able to provide some opportunities as well as the funding that would go with those opportunities to support that. But are you aware of how we can get that? Because I have an 11-year-old who's in 5th grade, and I have seen this, since the day she was born. It's been like a fear for me, where I have seen how far behind we are in Utah, but even as a whole in the country. Compared to other countries, even third world countries that are giving more opportunities for schooling, post-secondary schooling. And granted, it's not available for everybody, and not everybody can. And some of the jobs available that are very repetitive, whether it's cleaning the rec center or it is collecting the garbage cans at buildings or bagging groceries, there's something for everybody. But I feel like for those kids that can probably do more, there isn't anything unless I create the business, or I create, a company where I can employ my child. And are you aware of any groups or organizations that are pushing or having in with corporations that are providing that, so that I can better? I've been racking my brain as to what my daughter will be able to do. Is she going to do photography? Is she going to do a bakery? Is she going to do dance? Can she teach Zumba classes? I mean, lots of things from what I've seen other people do, but it's like they've created those opportunities. They've had to create those. And even the ones that have been very successful, nobody would even give them a chance to even be a fashion designer or teach them. So somebody was able to teach them, and then they created the company. The parents created it. So does that make sense?
No, it does. And I do think that there's a lot more responsibility put on the shoulders of parents than a lot of parents are actually have the skills to deal with themselves. It's a lot just to manage your own career, much less try to do that for someone else, where you're having to navigate a lot of different barriers. I will say, I tend to favor those opportunities where people are able to be included with everyone else, as opposed to some of the segregated settings, like where they've set up maybe, you know, a farm or something where it's exclusively people with disabilities. Because I think ultimately society loses out when they don't have people with disabilities among us and working and serving with us. But I see where that can be appealing to people when there aren't other options that are really helpful that are provided. I have heard, and I would like to be able to give you more details about it, about some apprenticeship programs that they have been starting with corporate America. And I think they were looking at Utah even being one of the pilot sites for giving opportunities for people to actually develop those skills in a corporation, so that it wasn't families having to shoulder the weight of all of it. And so if you want to reach out and email me, I can put you in contact with the person who told me about that. And I would love to give you that information. I think that there are companies that have been more creative and done a good job. Like, I think, oh gosh, was it Walgreens? Walgreens has a program where they have been very proactive in hiring people with disabilities, as has, I think, Lowe's in Kentucky. So there are some companies, but again, you want to make sure that it matches up, right? So if you have a youth who's really interested in acting, well, then you're going to have some really different partnerships for them to be able to pursue that goal. And I do think that making community connections all along the way helps to build an infrastructure of support, so that people are willing, like just regular community members, are willing to give your child a chance in hiring them because they know them and they've grown up with them. But I do think that it requires a web of all of those different opportunities, because that's what everybody else has, right? Like, everybody else can start a business, they can work for a company, they can be hired by a neighbor, they can, you know, everybody else has those opportunities, and we need to make sure that our youth with disabilities have that too. And it requires a combination of working on policy, working with employers, and, you know, as parents, having those expectations too. But it is complicated, and I'm happy to point you to all of the resources that I know about to give you more information.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And like I said, it's an excellent question. And I don't think it's one that we've done a terribly good job at yet, because we still have a low employment rate, and we need to work on that, right? So.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thanks for being so generous with your time and putting together this great presentation. And thank you for sharing all of those online resources that we can access later and look at in more detail. Stephanie's email is in the chat box, as well as the handout. We'll be posting this recording later, so if you have a friend that wasn't able to join, we will be posting and sharing that link to our members. And thank you to all of the parents who came and spent this afternoon with us. We are so grateful for all of you, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. And I will be in Utah more often, because I now have a child at BYU now. So I'd love to meet you in person if I'm ever around.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Sylvia.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.